Investigators are trying to figure out who shot a father of three in his own home and why.
When police arrived, they found 31-year-old father of three, Micheal Stewart, dead in his upstairs bathroom.
This is not the type of typical crime that we have in Mooresville, and especially not in this neighborhood.
Investigators say there is no sign of forced entry, and they can't tell if anything's missing from the home. Right now, they are just as baffled as neighbors.
As she was grabbing the baby and running, Matt went after the guy, and from what I understand, they shot him in the heart.
Right now, state and local investigators are going through every single inch of this house. They're trying to find any sort of evidence that could give them some sort of clue as to who could have done this or why. Right now, neighbors and friends say they are baffled. They can't understand why anyone would target a family that spent their lives serving others, break into their house, and shoot them.
Matthew Ryan Stewart was born on March 14, 1978, in the town where he would spend his entire life, Mooresville, a decent-sized town in North Carolina's Iredell County, which is a rather affluent suburb of Charlotte. Many refer to Mooresville as Race City, USA, due to it housing several NASCAR and IndyCar racing teams and drivers, and more than 30,000 people called it home as of the last census in 2010. Matt Stewart would graduate from Mooresville Senior High School and eventually go on to earn an associate's degree in nursing from Micheal Community College. But it was not an easy road to get there. Matt was reportedly involved in drugs during his early adulthood, something that he would express remorse for years later. However, according to those that knew Matt, these issues were just a minor roadblock for him, and he was able to rebuild his life around his burgeoning faith, becoming an avid Christian in his 20s. I was able to speak to Freddie Wilson, the host of the Unforgotten podcast, who has spent the last couple of years researching Matt's life story. As you'll hear, he was able to learn plenty about the kind of person Matt was, and how he used his ever-positive attitude to become a force of good.
One of the easiest parts of what I did was finding people to talk about Matt, because he impacted so many people's lives with the 31 years he was on this earth in so many positive ways. He was born and raised in Mooresville. He was the younger brother of older sister, Mandy, and he went to Mooresville public schools, graduated Mooresville High School in 1996. He was super into sports. Basketball, soccer. He was on the soccer team, and even into his adulthood, he never, took athletics to the collegiate level, to my knowledge. But he was always doing pickup basketball games, even as a young adult, with his friends. And then from the neighbors, I learned that on weekends and stuff, when he was not working, he was doing pickup games of soccer or basketball with the kids that lived in the neighborhood. So that was athletics were a huge part of his life. But I never heard stories about him being like over competitive or anything of that nature. He was a fun loving guy, loved kids. A lot of people talked about, how he was kind of, they speculated he liked kids because he was a kid himself. He liked playing pranks. He chose to be a nurse. People told me that he wanted to have a career where he was helping people, and particularly kids, like comforting kids that had illnesses. But at the hospital, connecting with some of the nurses there, I heard all these stories about pranks that Matt would play, lighthearted pranks that Matt would play on the staff, from like duct taping doors, like people would like walk into like a wall of tape, and all sorts of things. But he didn't like when people played pranks on him, which I thought was hilarious.
In the early 2000s, Matt would become enamored with a young woman from the church he was attending, a single mother named Angela Hare, who more commonly went by a shortened version of her first name, Angel. She had just recently given birth to her daughter, Hannah, when Matt and she started dating. Within months, the two would be engaged to be married, and Matt would end up adopting Hannah and raising her as his own. Over the next few years, Matt and Angel would have 2 additional kids, a daughter and a son, whose names I'll refrain from using in this episode because they are still minors. By all indications, the Stewarts were an extremely happy and content family, with both Matt and Angel having established careers of their own. Both Matt and Angel worked in the nursing field, with Matt working at the Lake Norman Regional Medical Center in Mooresville, while Angel worked at another hospital in Charlotte. Matt's co-workers would later recount that he did not socialize much outside of work because he spent most of his free time with his family, and he would not have had it any other way. Together, this family lived in the Gabriel Estates subdivision in northern Mooresville, which was a relatively normal housing community in the more blue-collar section of town. While their house was located near a local 2-lane highway, there was a house behind them that acted as a buffer, and they were surrounded on almost every side by other houses. Nothing about the location or layout of their home would indicate that those within had anything to fear. As the clock crept past midnight in the early morning hours of June 9th, 2009, everything in the Gabriel Estates subdivision was quiet. Some neighbors would later recall feeling odd, stating that they felt uneasy at some point that evening, like someone was watching them, but no one would be able to explain why exactly, just that they felt off. In the Stewart household, however, trouble was brewing. While the exact series of events have never been cleared up, we do have an approximate timeline of events which we can match up with witness statements. Matt and Angel's oldest daughter, Hannah, was at a friend's house for a sleepover, a neighborhood friend who lived just down the road, whom she had been friends with for some time. But the remaining 2 children were inside the home, along with Matt and Angel. Earlier that evening, Matt had gotten out of bed to grab the couple's young son and brought him into their bedroom, but they had since fallen asleep, and things were quiet inside of the home. Just after midnight, a dark presence emerged in the master bedroom, who, without warning, began shooting at the married couple asleep in their bed. Matt was reportedly hit by a bullet right away, but jumped up and began struggling with the unknown intruder, wrestling him into the nearby bathroom, where a vicious scuffle would ensue. Angel, meanwhile, had been grazed in the wrist with a bullet, and would end up fleeing the home with her young son, who had been asleep in the bed right between her and Matt. Carrying her son in her uninjured arm, Angel headed to a neighbor's house nearby to call for help. That neighbor, Mike Lawson, would later tell reporters with WBTV that Angel showed up at his doorstep holding her young son, and both were covered in blood. Quote, "She rang the doorbell, and then she come to the door, and she looked at me and said she'd been shot," unquote. At the neighbor's house, Angel would phone 911, with the call being received by local dispatchers at 12:45 a.m. This is verified by the official call log, which showed that officers were dispatched within moments and arrived at the scene at 12:49 a.m., just 4 minutes later. However, by the time they arrived, the scene inside of the Stewart home was dead silent, with there being no sign of any activity since Angel had come running out with her young son. There was no sign of the intruder, who had reportedly started firing at the sleeping couple from their bedroom doorway. There was no sight of Matt, who had last been seen fighting off this gunman in order to save his family, nor any sign of Matt and Angel's daughter, their middle child, who by all accounts was still inside of the home. Over the next 20 or so minutes, more officers began arriving at the scene, and it became apparent that the situation inside of the Stewart home was not changing. There had been no sign of life inside whatsoever, and authorities began to fear that a potential hostage situation was playing out in front of their very eyes. The special response team was called to the location, and police would choose not to enter the Stewart home for some time, choosing to hold off on doing so until well after 2 a.m., more than an hour after originally arriving at the scene. It wasn't until 2:30 a.m. that officers decided to enter the home, and within moments, they would discover the body of Matt Stewart. There, in the upstairs bathroom, his body was found covered in and surrounded by blood, the victim of an incredibly violent altercation, having died attempting to save the lives of his family, reportedly fighting off their attacker until his final breath. But just a minute later, another call would come over the radio, proclaiming that a child had been found inside of the home, absolutely unscathed. Matt and Angel's youngest daughter had been left inside of the house during Angel's chaotic escape, but was later brought out unharmed. In fact, it would later be reported that the child had slept through the entire ordeal. A bizarre note in an even more bizarre case, which began to unfold that balmy summer morning. It was immediately apparent that Matt Stewart's death had been a violent one. The bloody crime scene left behind was proof enough of that, but the autopsy would reveal that Matt's death had been even more violent than originally expected, with him having been shot and stabbed several times in a gross act of overkill. The autopsy would note that Matt had sustained gunshots to his head, neck, chest, back, and arm, with one gunshot hitting his spinal column, severing his brainstem, a wound that would have almost immediately killed him if he wasn't already dead. In addition, he had been stabbed dozens of times, to his neck, jaw, ear, and head, with cuts and scrapes to his upper extremities pointing to a significant number of defensive wounds. There were also signs of blunt force trauma to several parts of Matt's body, which had likely been sustained during some of the other injuries, namely when the unknown intruder had begun stabbing Matt, using significant force when doing so. Here is Freddie from the Unforgotten podcast, who discussed the specifics of the autopsy with a couple of forensic experts, who each gave their own opinions on what may have caused this obscene level of violence.
There was some, I don't know if people caught in that, I think, fourth episode when I brought in the two experts. One was a forensic pathologist and the other is a forensic psychiatrist. And there was actually a little bit of, I wouldn't say disagreement, but they had their own interpretations of what you could actually learn from the autopsy in particular. So Carol Lieberman Dr. Carol Lieberman seemed to infer from everything that it was a personal crime, it was overkill, and Judy Melanik, Dr. Judy Melanik, didn't have that. She didn't say that it wasn't, but she said that from the autopsy alone, you really couldn't conclude that. She was careful to say that, since I had heard from other people who claimed to have heard from law enforcement, and people that claimed to have knowledge of the case and be close with family members that knew about it, that police had honed in on it being personal and being brutal and having that overkill aspect. She really cautioned against. She was clear to say, the autopsy, it could have been, sometimes there are brutal murders that result, the multitude of wounds result from somebody fighting back. So it could have been a robbery gone wrong where the person shoots and the other person starts fighting back, and, there's anger that happens because someone is being attacked or, is being retaliated against. But I think looking outside of the autopsy alone, you have a situation where the house in question is not right off a main road. It's not in a neighborhood where this really ever happens. There's no sign of forced entry, which is huge. I tried to get a number on like a percentage of like how many home invasions where there's no sign of forced entry, how many of those have an offender that doesn't know the victim. And I don't know if you're knowledgeable on this, but I couldn't find the exact number because because of the lack of forced entry, but I found some just sheer numbers on home invasion murders, and it's vast majority of them, the victim knows who killed them, knows that, had a relationship with the person that killed them. So it's, given all of that context, it definitely seems like it was a crime of passion, not necessarily a romantic passion, but someone that had some kind of relationship with him that had severe animosity. But all of that said, there's so many details about the crime scene that we don't know by, virtue of it being unsolved, and because police have chosen to not say a daggum word about the case in almost 10 years.
Yeah.
Probably about 10 years, is when they stopped mentioning it at all. Having gone down there myself to that neighborhood and talking with the neighbors, it seemed like a very targeted, I wouldn't even say targeted. I would say it seemed very specific. I think I was in the mindset at one point or another in the beginning, thinking that somebody set out that day to kill Matt Stewart. And I think that after thinking about it and hearing the stories from certain individuals and thinking about it more critically, I've also strongly considered the possibility that this was perhaps an argument that got out of hand, that this was not something that was planned, but perhaps, and this is just me speculating, that perhaps it was something that erupted between people. And I think if you looked at how most homicides occur, that's probably that's probably a good majority of them are not someone setting out to, harm someone else, but rather disputes that erupt organically and escalation until someone is killed.
Intriguingly, it was learned that 2 separate firearms had been used in the commission of this crime. During the autopsy, both 38 and 40 caliber bullets would be recovered from Matt's body, leading to the conclusion that 2 separate firearms had been used. Some theorized that this might have been due to there being 2 gunmen, perhaps one that came to the aid of the other when they began struggling with Matt, but authorities have released no information pointing in that direction over the past 11 years. As far as we know, there was just one killer, but this somehow resulted in Matt sustaining gunshot wounds from 2 separate firearms.
It seems like there were multiple guns, and that brings a whole other set of questions. You walk into a room with someone that is lying on a bed, and you come supposedly completely unexpected, and you not only manage to miss the first and second time, the person is able to get up and fight you off, and you need to use another gun. It doesn't make any sense. So it leads me to wonder if that's really what happened. Somebody waltzing into a room and, pointing their gun at the bed. Again, that could be what happened, totally. But it's definitely led me to consider other alternative scenarios.
The day after the incident, Captain Thomas Thompson from the Mooresville Police Department would tell the press, "Right now, we just have nothing solid to go on. This is not the type of typical crime that we have in Mooresville, and especially not in this neighborhood." Police began expanding their crime scene from the known location of the crime, the Stewart home, to include their entire neighborhood, Gabriel Estates, which was a normal middle-class housing subdivision in northern Mooresville, full of blue-collar families very similar to the Stewarts. To make matters even more complicated, there was no sign of any forced entry into the house, although the back door would appear to be unlocked. An abnormality, to be sure, as the Stewarts typically always made sure to lock up before they went to bed. It would later be theorized that this was how the killer had made their escape. running off into the woods behind the house, and perhaps driving off via the nearby highway, which, it should be noted, would not be impossible to get to from the Stewart home, but would be rather difficult because of the local flora. Surprisingly, none of the Stewart's neighbors recalled seeing or hearing anything out of the ordinary that night, at least not until police officers began arriving just a few minutes before 1 a.m. Despite Matt having been shot multiple times by rather large caliber handguns, none of his neighbors had reported hearing anything at all, nothing that indicated a struggle taking place, or even a single gunshot. One neighbor that lived just down the street, and was reportedly awake at the time of the alleged shooting with an open window, did not report hearing anything untoward that evening. Despite there being a couple of neighboring houses located just a dozen or so feet away from the Stewart's home, in a quiet and sleepy subdivision, none of Matt and Angel's neighbors would recall hearing any gunshots or sign of a struggle that evening. However, as Freddie will explain, this might not be as strange as it sounds.
That was another thing that Judy Melanik, she's very knowledgeable. We talked about the gunshots and no one hearing anything. And she added a bit of, what would you call it? She added a bit of perspective on it that, that sound is really weird. And there have been situations where hurricanes or like a tornado rips through a neighborhood and the kids are still asleep in their beds. And I brought up, well, this is kind of a rural neighborhood and it's super quiet. And she said, well, that actually lends itself to people not hearing the gunshots, because she said, like if she was investigating a crime in an urban setting and there was a shooting in an apartment, and the people below or people next door or above didn't hear it, she said that would be really weird because there's so much for the sound to bounce and reverberate off of. But in a rural or more rural setting or suburban setting, there's less of that. So she kind of cautioned on me assuming or listeners assuming that silencers would have had to have been used. Just that, not that to say that they weren't, or not to say that it's not weird that nobody heard gunshots, but just to kind of clarify that sound perception or hearing things when you're not expecting them, or people are sleeping, what they can sleep through, is kind of a weird thing, and it's not necessarily a miracle or it's not out of the realm of possibility that 40 caliber shots could have gone off, 38 caliber shots, and nobody heard anything. Is it weird? Yeah. Is it, would it be unheard of? Not so much.
From the outbreak of this story, it was reported that no one had seen the killer, not even Angel, Matt's wife, who initially claimed that she did not get a good look at the person who had been shooting at her and Matt in their bedroom. According to statements made over the years, this unknown subject had not said a single word or even made a noticeable sound before he started firing at the sleeping couple, and Matt's quick reaction, jumping up after getting shot and wrestling the shooter into a nearby bathroom, apparently prevented Angel from getting a good look at him. In interviews with detectives, Angel was unable to give any kind of description of this killer, other than the detail that he was a tall male. This wasn't really anything that investigators could include in a profile, which allowed them to keep their options open moving forward, but did little to narrow down the list of potential suspects. Over the next couple of weeks, however, Mooresville police officials would begin telling local residents to not be overly concerned about the crime, believing that no one else was in imminent danger of being harmed. This led to the working theory that the killer was someone known to Matt and his loved ones, who may have specifically targeted Matt in this shooting, but that theory would get quickly overshadowed by the first and only named suspect in this case.
Police in a small town in rural South Carolina are living in fear tonight, waiting to hear if there's a break in the case of a serial killer on the loose. 5 people have been shot to death in little more than a week in the town of Gaffney.
In the final week of June 2009, a killer began to haunt the residents of Gaffney, South Carolina, a small town about 70 miles southwest of Mooresville. The first killing happened on June 27th, with the victim being a prominent peach farmer named Klein Cash, who was shot and killed inside of his own living room, with his wife discovering his body later that day. The second crime occurred just 4 days later, on July 1st, with 2 more victims, 83-year-old Hazel Linder and her 50-year-old daughter, Gina Linder Parker, being found inside of the elder woman's home, having been bound and then shot. The third crime was reported just a day later, July 2nd, after 48-year-old Steven Tyler was shot and killed inside of his own furniture store. His body was discovered by his 15-year-old daughter, Abby, who came in to check on her father. While doing so, Abby was shot and injured by the same assailant, dying from her wounds in the hospital just a couple of days later. All 5 of these murders seem to bear strange similarities. The victims were all shot and killed with a .25 caliber firearm, with some of their money and valuables being stolen by the offender. But strangely, not all items of value had been stolen from the crime scene. Some money and valuables had been suspiciously left behind, indicating that theft wasn't this killer's primary motive. Because of this, no perceivable motive could be determined in the spree, with the crimes being attributed to random violence from a single individual. As you can imagine, this rash of bizarre, violent killings would put small-town Gaffney, South Carolina in the national spotlight, leading to a frenzied manhunt for the killer, who had been seen by witnesses driving an older model Ford Explorer, and whose likeness was soon portrayed in police sketches distributed throughout the region. On July 6th, 2009, a little over a week after the spree began, a burglary in process was reported in Dallas, North Carolina, which is roughly halfway between Mooresville and Gaffney. Here, witnesses in a quiet neighborhood noticed a suspicious Ford Explorer matching the Gaffney killer's vehicle, which had been parked outside of an abandoned house. 3 people were going back and forth between the vehicle and the empty home, and police were called to speak to these individuals that evening. 2 of the 3 individuals were a couple of siblings, Mark and Sharon Stamey, who were known to police as a couple of transients that often squatted in abandoned homes like this one. They had been seen in the neighborhood before, and were known to avoid trouble for the most part, but it was the third person that they were with, a large mountain of a man who stood nearly 7 feet tall and weighed at least 250 pounds, that raised some eyebrows. Not only did this individual match the description of the killer from Gaffney, but it soon became evident that this individual was attempting to avoid police suspicion. After officers arrived at the scene, this man would give them a fake name when questioned. Eventually, they were able to determine his real name, Patrick Tracy Burris, learning that he had been a recently paroled inmate who had violated the terms of his probation over a month prior and was being sought after for arrest. Officers would attempt to apprehend Burris that evening, but in the brief struggle that would ensue, Burris would pull out a firearm, using it to shoot one officer in the leg, thankfully a non-lethal injury. Subsequent shots were aimed at Burris, who was killed in a short-lived police shootout, dying before paramedics could arrive at the scene. Almost as soon as Patrick Tracy Burris was identified by police that night, it became clear that he had likely been the previously unidentified killer from Gaffney, who, despite matching the technical description of a serial killer, was more of a spree killer because of the short-lived window of his crimes, with there being no real cool-down period between them. This made sense, given Burris's naturally impulsive behavior. Patrick Tracy Burris had a long history of criminal activity, dating back to his early adulthood. He had committed a wide range of offenses such as larceny, forgery, breaking and entering, blackmail, and extortion over more than 2 decades, with these offenses being stretched across multiple states in the Southeast and along the East Coast: Florida, Virginia, West Virginia, Maryland, and the Carolinas. He had been in a North Carolina prison as recently as April of 2009, about 2 months before this rash of killings started, having served 8 years for some prior felonies. In the months after his release, he had fallen off of the grid, failing to check in with his probation officer, hence the warrant being issued for his arrest. However, he had seemingly begun to indulge in his darkest urges, obtaining a firearm and using it repeatedly over a 1-week period that summer. It was later learned, through ballistics testing, that the .25 caliber pistol that he had used to shoot a police officer on the night of his death was the same weapon that had been used in all 5 of the Gaffney killings. It was initially theorized that these killings had been committed to facilitate armed robbery, with Burris likely trying to steal money or valuables from the victims in order to procure methamphetamine for himself. However, it was theorized that Burris's crimes could extend beyond that 1-week period, with police being unable to trace his whereabouts for the preceding month or so. At the time of Matt Stewart's murder, Patrick Tracy Burris had reportedly been in the Mooresville area, with him confirmed to have been in the greater Charlotte area that summer, and traveling through Mooresville specifically on several occasions. He also had a prior history of breaking and entering, and had become evidently unhinged in the weeks after Matt's murder. Perhaps this indicated some kind of involvement in the crime, with the event in Mooresville serving as a catalyst for his more violent behavior later that month. Burris was also incredibly tall, standing 6 feet 8 inches tall and having a stocky build, so he could have matched the rather generic description of the shooter given by Matt's wife. But then again, so would probably several hundreds of men in the surrounding area. Despite ballistics providing a clear link between Burris and the Gaffney killings, that was not the case when it came to Matt Stewart's murder. The only weapon that Burris had in his possession at the time of his death was the .25 caliber pistol used in the Gaffney crimes, and that was not at all what had been used in the Mooresville crime. If you recall, Matt had been shot by a .38 caliber and .40 caliber pistol. However, some newspapers would report that Burris had sold at least 2 separate firearms to acquaintances of his in the weeks before his death, but I can find no verification of that in the years since, nor any sign that they might have matched the murder weapons used in Matt's case, making it a rather moot point. Police would eventually state that there was no connection between Patrick Tracy Burris and the still unsolved murder of Matt Stewart, highlighting the fact that Burris's known murders had happened over the span of a single week, and all of these crimes took place just miles apart from one another in Gaffney. There was no indication that his spree had started 1 month prior, dozens of miles away, and there was no piece of physical or circumstantial evidence linking him to the murder of Matt Stewart. Despite this, however, many in the region have come to believe that Burris was Matt's killer, with police simply not having enough evidence to make a public declaration. As far as I know, that is not the case. But police have refused to answer any specific questions about possible connections in the years since, due to them not wanting to compromise their ongoing investigation. Now, we're going to pause for just a moment to hear a word from today's sponsors. Today's episode is also brought to you by BetterHelp. Is there something that interferes with your happiness or is preventing you from achieving your goals? If so, BetterHelp Online Counseling is here for you. Through BetterHelp, you can connect with a professional counselor in a safe and private online environment, which is incredibly convenient, especially in the age of COVID. You can get help on your own time and at your own pace, and you can schedule secure video or phone sessions with your therapist. Plus, there are chat and text options available. Anything you share is confidential, and you can speak to a licensed professional counselor that specializes in depression, stress, anxiety, family conflicts, LGBTQ+ concerns, grief, trauma, relationships, and anything else that you might be dealing with at the moment. If you are not happy with your counselor, you can request a new one at any time for no additional charge. Thousands of therapists are available worldwide at any time, and you can start communicating in under 24 hours. Best of all, BetterHelp is a truly affordable option. Unresolved listeners can now get 10% off of their first month with the discount code Unresolved. So, why not get started today? Go to betterhelp.com/unresolved. Fill out BetterHelp's questionnaire, and then let them assess your needs and get you matched with a counselor you will love. Once again, use the discount code Unresolved to get 10% off of your first month at betterhelp.com/unresolved. Now, let's return to the show.
Back in June, a husband and a wife were asleep in their upstairs bedroom here when a stranger came in, brutally attacked and killed the husband. Now, the wife was able to escape across the street to call 911 from a neighbor's house, but she didn't get a very good look at the killer. And now, some 2 months later, police still don't have any real clues in the case.
This is very unusual for our town.
Police spent days combing the crime scene around 31-year-old Matthew Stewart.
He had chosen healthcare as his profession, and every day he got up and went to work to help people.
The father of 3 was shot to death late one night in his own bedroom by an unidentified man.
This to be quite honest, is pretty baffling.
His wife and children escaped the attack with only minor wounds, but they didn't get a good look at the killer, leaving police with little to go on.
At the end of the day, it's really going to come down to the public coming forward with information.
That's why they're turning to the public for help, and now the governor is lending a hand.
We received a $5,000 reward through the governor's office.
For neighbors,
we think about it a lot.
They're hopeful this new incentive could turn the tide and bring some closure.
I really hope that they find who did this. It's a heinous crime, and I really feel bad for the children.
Now, this is a copy of the proclamation that the governor signed saying that this crime caused severe trauma to the community. And since the State Bureau of Investigation is involved, she's using state money to help bring it to a close. Again, the total reward here now is $1,000 from Crime Stoppers, $5,000 from the state, and $5,000 from the family, for a grand total of $11,000 for any information leading to an arrest. Call the Mooresville Police Department if you have that information.
2 months after the senseless murder of Matt Stewart, authorities would reveal a doubling of the reward in the case for any information leading to an arrest. This would prove to be just one of the few updates in the case over the years, which was followed closely by the release of a suspect sketch in January of 2010, nearly 6 months after Matt's murder. With the release of this police sketch, authorities were disclosing information about this killer for the first time, nearly half a year after the tragic loss of life. This killer was described as a tall, large-framed man who weighed approximately 250 pounds, with pretty average facial features. In the sketch, which you can find online and I will put on the Unresolved website, you can see that the man is described as being bald, with a large forehead, narrow eyes that are set pretty widely apart, a flat, large nose, and with stubble covering his rather square jaw. No information was disclosed about how police had come upon the necessary information needed for this sketch, but it was widely believed that Matt's wife Angel had been able to give this description of the potential offender months after the shooting. Personally, I find the release of the police sketch to be a little suspect, since witness recollections are often imperfect, and that's only amplified when you factor in weeks and months of post-traumatic stress. But when you also factor in the time it took for police to release this rather vague sketch, it leads me to believe that this information might not have been rock solid, to say the least. And it seems like then Mooresville Police Chief Carl Robbins must have felt the same way, because shortly after this sketch was released, Robbins described it as just one piece of the puzzle, and stressed that the sketch was just an artist rendering of the suspect. As quoted in the Mooresville Tribune, quote, "It is detailed, but at the same time it's not to be confused with a photograph, so there might be some things that aren't exactly to scale and that kind of thing," unquote. For years, the working theory ascribed to this case was that Matt Stewart was the victim of a home invasion gone wrong, perhaps a burglary that turned sour when the culprit decided to take aim at Matt and Angel in their bed. However, a lot of people have pushed back against this theory for a number of reasons. To start, there was no sign of forced entry in the Stewart home that night. In fact, other than the unlocked back door, it was unknown how the intruder had gained entry or made his way from the family's home, with the back door likely being unlocked because it had been how the killer escaped. To add on to this, there was no sign of anything being stolen. Nothing of value was reported missing from the Stewart's home after the murder, at least nothing that investigators ever found. There were also no reports of break-ins in the neighborhood both before or after the murder, which to me would indicate that this wasn't just a burglar that got lucky by finding an unlocked back door. Freddie, the host of the Unforgotten podcast, would seem to agree.
I mean, the one thing I would admit is that the house is technically viewable. You could see the house it's visible from a highway, but it's kind of a rural highway, and it's just the top of the house. And
yeah, there's a house between them, isn't there?
There it is. Yeah. So you would have had to have walked, there are houses right off the highway. You would have had to have walked through the side yards of those houses and gone down a berm that had, leaves and trees and everything. That's a relatively steep hill to get to the backyard of the Stewarts. So, I mean, that is possible. But it would be hard to see why someone would want to do that specifically rather than drive into the neighborhood. why their house would be chosen, and then how they could have possibly gotten in and out without breaking and entering. It just, they stumble on the one house that has the back door unlocked. It doesn't make much sense.
I would also like to push back against the idea of this being a burglary gone wrong with a final thought. Most burglars try to break into homes while the occupants are gone in order to avoid trouble. I don't see why a burglar would break into a home with 2 adults and 2 children inside and then open fire on them before stealing anything. Plus, according to the official narrative, the killer was able to sneak into the house and make it upstairs without being seen or heard, and without leaving any trace of themselves or their methods afterward. Why would they just begin shooting at the sleeping couple in their bed? To me, this theory just doesn't make any sense. At this point, I think it's worth diving into one of the more touchy parts of this story, the official narrative, as relayed by Matt's wife, Angel. This is a part of the story that Freddie has reported upon heavily in his own podcast, Unforgotten, and you'll hear from him again in just a minute. However, before then, I'm going to try and lay out some of these confusing points, which remain points of contention today. According to the official narrative, Matt and Angel were asleep in their bed when the tall gunman began shooting at them from the doorway to their bedroom. Wedged between them was their young son, who Angel grabbed and fled out of the house with, while Matt began wrestling the killer into a nearby bathroom. In this chaos, Angel was shot at least once in her arm, although another report would claim that she had been shot in her hand. This is a minor discrepancy on my part, but Angel herself admitted in her only public interview, released as part of a music video for a Christian musical act called Big Daddy Weave, that the wound simply required stitches and did not seem to be overly serious. Yet, according to the Stewart's neighbor, Matt Lawson, whose house Angel ran to after fleeing the shooter, both Angel and her son were covered in blood. It's possible that this had been caused by a simple gunshot wound to the wrist, which according to some reports was just a graze. But details about what exactly happened that night remain clouded in secrecy. In the years since, some have also come to scrutinize Angel for her actions during the shooting. While fleeing to the neighbor's house with her son to get help and call 911, Angel, likely unintentionally, left behind her youngest daughter inside of the house along with Matt and this unknown killer. If you recall, this daughter was left inside of the house for the better part of 2 hours, with police not entering the home until 2:30 a.m., when they discovered that this daughter was still fast asleep. In several online forums, commenters have questioned Angel's maternal instincts, but that's not really something that I consider my place to judge. After all, I'm not a parent, so I can't judge anybody else on their reaction to an ordeal like this. And also, having interviewed people that have suffered through pretty traumatic ordeals themselves, I know that everyone faces adversity differently. Fight or flight reflexes are impossible to predict, and I have no idea how I would react in a similar situation. However, it is worth noting that according to the Stewart's neighbor, Matt Lawson, the same man whose house Angel fled to after the shooting, Angel did not mention once that her youngest daughter was still inside of the house. I consider that to be a little odd. It's also worth mentioning at this point that Angel's mother, Brenda, Matt's mother-in-law, has become an important component of the narrative. As recounted by Freddie in his podcast, she told people connected to the case that on the night of the murder, about an hour or 2 prior, she woke up in distress. According to some people, she had had a bad dream, and according to others, she woke up with a bad feeling. It's hard to tell which is which. Regardless, this encouraged her to drive to the Stewart's home about 70 miles away shortly before the shooting took place. Although reports tend to vary on when she showed up that evening, and what her intention for being there might have been. On his podcast, Unforgotten, Freddie has attempted to verify this information from neighbors and those connected to the case.
I think it was the 4th episode where I interviewed someone that was anonymous that talked about and Hannah herself talked about that the Matt's mother-in-law, her grandmother, would watch the kids. She was an integral part of their lives. There was other people that claimed, and this was a claim that was shared by multiple people that were not connected. Whether it's true or not, I don't know. But the claim that Hannah was actually supposed to go to the beach with her grandmother that next day. So I say all of that to say that her being at the house is not in and of itself suspicious at all. She was over there a lot. I talked to the neighbor down the street who said that he recognized her car immediately because she was always there. He didn't even know the family that well, but he knew that the mother-in-law would come by all the time. So, I just want to get that out there, that her being there at the house is not suspicious. Her, from what I've heard from multiple people, being there shortly after the crime happened late at night. My understanding, there are certain people that did not choose to go on the record with me that I talked to. Try to figure out how to phrase this. It doesn't seem like, I'm pretty confident in saying that she wasn't called after the fact. She could have been. I could have been lied to. But it seems like, and from people that I've talked to that claim to have spoken directly to her, have said that what she told them was she had had a bad dream or she had had a bad feeling. Some people said feeling, some people said dream. There was something that caused her to go in the middle of the night that was out of the ordinary. And that consistently, even out of the mouths of people that don't believe there's anything anything suspicious or anything nefarious or anything like that transpired with her, they have said, that's what she told me, that she had this dream, she had this feeling, and that's why she went.
Another cloudy piece of information in this story is the notion that Matt himself was looking to obtain a firearm in the months before his death. A handful of Matt's friends have spoken openly about him wanting to obtain a gun for home protection, specifically in the week before his murder in June of 2009. Apparently, when he asked a friend to help him pick out the proper gun. It's unknown if this was due to any perceived threat, but I would be remiss if I did not mention this. Over the years, rumors have proliferated about Matt and his access to drugs. This seems to be based primarily on his early adult life, when he was self-admittedly involved in drug usage and potential drug dealing. Rumors would begin to spread after his death that he had been involved in illegal prescription distribution as a nurse, using his proximity to drugs to obtain medications illegally and sell them to people in the area. However, it's also worth pointing out that these were just rumors, which have not been substantiated by any evidence whatsoever over the years. In fact, Matt's fellow co-workers at the hospital have openly dismissed these allegations, and it seems like these rumors were mainly propagated by those that did not personally know Matt, but speculated about his case online. Because Matt's murder remains unsolved, it's hard not to give a second look at his substance abuse issues in early adulthood. It's possible that his death might have been connected to these issues, but I think it's very unlikely, as does Freddie.
For the sake of the record and everything else, he, like virtually everybody, I think, not everybody, but most American teenagers growing up, he did drugs. He, got to a point, I think, as a young adult, where he knew that he needed to redirect his life. And I did find that he probably got into things that most kids might not. He was on a path that was not good and was getting into some bad things. He never heard anything about him being violent with anybody. Never heard a thing about him being unkind to anyone, stealing or anything like that. But I did hear about stories about him having trouble with substances. But I never heard a word about him going back to that life once he left it, once he found Religion was a big part of his life. And once he kind of redirected himself and found his faith again, I never heard anything about him going back to that previous, using illegal substances or alcoholism or anything like that. But if we're being fair, if we're being, you can always wonder, and you can think he did have a past of stuff like that. But I think the majority of the evidence, whether it's substantial or if it's just anecdotal, it just seems, to the people that knew him best, it seems ludicrous that would have had to do with what happened to him. Mm-hmm. He was out of that life for, and I say that life, he was clean, off of drugs, or were using illegal substances for, when he was like 20, and he was 31 when he died. So a long time.
Based off everything I've heard and read, it seems like that was very much like a thing of the distant past. Like that was a third of his life.
And I think probably most listeners will be able to relate to that, whether it was them or someone that they know that in their youth got involved with some, partying a little too hard or whatever you want to call it, that turned their life around, and, you wouldn't associate that with them anymore. It seemed to be no different with him. But I guess, when someone is murdered in this way and there's no answers, it would be, you have to bring it up, and you have to, I guess, leave the realm of possibility open, as hard as it may be.
In 2018, nearly a decade after Matt Stewart's still unsolved murder, the Unforgotten podcast launched. Put together by Freddie, Unforgotten has become one of the few outlets to distribute information about this case over the past decade, and remains, without a doubt, the most comprehensive. In the podcast, Freddie explores not only the life and death of Matt, but details how he came to be familiar with the story.
I grew up going to this school since I was like in 6th grade. My parents put me in this private Christian school that was associated with River Life Fellowship. And River Life is a relatively small church, probably like 200-300, that is intimately involved in a movement that is called the New Apostolic Reformation. There was a lot of love, there was a lot of belonging, and I had a great experience overall. One of the things that happened 2009, when Matt Stewart was murdered, it really shook the atmosphere of the school, and the teachers, I'd say at that point, probably more than half of the students were from families that went to River Life. So, but I didn't really think about it too much. I remember as I went on to college and everything, I would occasionally Google it to see if there had been any movement on the case. And always thought it was weird that it kind of disappeared. And it wasn't until probably 2017 when my older brother got me onto Serial, the podcast, that I thought, this is really cool. Something to listen to while I'm driving or on long trips. And I went from that to Up and Vanished, which I'm not sure if you've listened to that, but listening to this situation, someone going into a cold case, this kid that's got a microphone interviewing people and bringing this back to everyone's attention, and then halfway through the season or whatever, something actually happens, and it's probably indirectly linked to someone going in and stirring up conversation, bringing people's mind back to the case. And as I was listening, I was on this long cross-country train trip, and I just got this idea. this podcaster has to go and investigate Matt Stewart's murder. The next few months I spent trying to get somebody to look at it. So I was contacting all these different podcasters and documentarians. And at one point, someone, I can't even remember who it was, said, well, why don't you write up like what everything that's out there on this murder and then send it to us and then we'll take a look at it. And that caused me to sit down and track everything that's out there, compile all the articles. And it wasn't really until that point that I realized how little was out there on the case. And that's more or less when I came to the conclusion that there's a reason why nobody's looked at this and the difficulty that folks would have in sinking their teeth into it without greater context, not knowing some of the details of the intricacies of the community and all of that. So that's when I more or less decided I'm going to take a look at it, and that's when I ended up reaching out to Hannah, Matt's daughter, and then it all blew up from there.
During the making of this podcast, which spans 2 seasons and includes several bonus Q&A episodes, Freddie has been able to speak to several people close to Matt, his neighbors, co-workers, friends, and even some of his family members. Early on, he was able to speak to Matt's oldest daughter, Hannah, as well as Matt's sister, who inadvertently turned this story into a bit of an obsession for Freddie.
I think the big turning point in the whole thing was when I got that interview with his sister, and I asked that pretty simple question of, she said, police have always been clear that they think that it was that whoever did this was someone close to my brother. And I asked, well, has there been any thoughts of who that could be? And her response to that's kind of when everything broke open, and I realized that I was onto something really big.
Yeah, if I remember that correctly, she said that police had eliminated a suspect that was close to the family. But
yeah,
they were kind of wary. Well, she was kind of wary about the way she answered that and said that she didn't want to implicate anyone.
But essentially all she would tell me was that there was someone that the police had cleared that Matt knew, that was known to the family and had lived in Mooresville but later moved away. That was essentially all I got. And having subsequent interviews with other people, found someone that I believe she was referring to. Now, I never got any kind of confirmation on that, but it seemed like, having talked to other family members, there was someone that was on Matt's side of the family, connected only through marriage, not by blood, that was involved in law enforcement that people had some suspicions about. And when I reached out to him, he confirmed that he had been interviewed by police. So that more or less to me confirmed, okay, this is probably who was being referred to there.
As you just heard, statements made to Freddie have indicated that certain family members know of a primary suspect who was previously known to them, who police supposedly ruled out in the wake of the murder. However, during the making of Freddie's podcast, he was told by relatives of Matt that the killer was still out there, potentially even following along with the podcast. These family members would ask Freddie to take down the podcast, which they alleged was putting them all in danger, but they would not relay any specific threats. And when asked to weigh in by Freddie, local law enforcement punted on the issue, simply claiming that these family members had been through a lot, quote unquote. All of this leads me to believe that more information might be known by select family members of Matt. In particular, those that claim their lives are in danger, but have released no knowledge about this threat to law enforcement. In the years since, these family members have not disclosed who they believe the killer to be, or why their lives are supposedly in danger, but remain enraged at Freddie for simply attempting to learn more about this case. I can understand them all wanting to move on after such a tragic loss. While I can't really comprehend the severity of their tragedy, I have spoken to enough survivors of violent crime and the loved ones of victims to know how much resolution can mean. When it comes to Matt Stewart's case, it seems like the only person attempting to raise awareness or gather information seems to be Freddie, with no other outlet publishing an article about the case since the early 2010s. What I can't understand is why these family members would want to shut down Freddie's podcast, especially since he has not taken any advertising and has not made any money from it. Because while Matt Stewart's life was tragically cut short, his killer is still out there and can potentially repeat this level of violence against others. While we should always respect the privacy and wishes of victims and their families, we also need to remind ourselves that in this case, an incredibly violent offender has not been identified or held accountable for this savage act. That is a constant threat to others. Even though Freddie has wrapped up work on the Unforgotten podcast for the time being, he continues to gather information in the case. And over the past few years, he has been able to learn a lot about the individual at the center of the story, Matt Stewart himself.
I expected, I'll be honest, I expected early on that the more I dug into the case, I would be confronted with difficult things about Matt. I think we all instinctively sometimes, whether we know it or not, when there's this brutal crime, we think, well, there's got to be, something that they were involved in, something nefarious. Maybe they've got a dark side. And I'm not saying that about Matt is totally not true, because there could be things I don't know, but it was more of a situation where the more I learned about this guy, the more depressing it was that he was taken so viciously and so early in life. And, I've come to believe, and other people have expressed it too, that we're, his friends, that if it was someone that he loved, he would be dogged in his approach to find justice. And, he was someone that was always more concerned about other people than he was about himself. Whether that was his involvement with the youth at church, whether it was his life as a father and husband, or whether it was his career. He was always looking out for other people, rather at the expense of himself sometimes. So it makes it all the more painful, I think, for people that loved him to know that he was taken the way that he was taken, and that justice hasn't been done. I think all of that, propelled me, or has propelled me to continue to be interested in the case. Not that it's my belief that everyone deserves justice. I don't care what choices they made in their life, but it's particularly heart-wrenching, I think, when it's someone like that was consistently doing for others, and is taken that way, and there's no answers, and there's silence, just complete and utter disrespectful silence from law enforcement. It's not something they want to talk about, and that it gets me angry. A 10-year mark, this small, well, it's not really a small town anymore, but it's a relatively safe place, that people, it's a great place to live, and raise a family. And you look for unsolved murders in Mooresville, and you're not going to find many. This is really one of the only unsolved murders that they have. And at the 10-year mark, they say absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. That was insulting.
The Mooresville Police Department continues to oversee this investigation, more than 11 years after it began. However, in recent years, the department has been plagued with rumors of workplace misconduct and corruption, which began to reach a head in 2019. Last year, the MPD chief was forced to resign after being put on administrative leave along with a police captain, and 2 senior command staffers were demoted. These were just a portion of the punishments doled out after a lengthy internal investigation, which was looking into claims of sexual and racial discrimination in the workplace over a prolonged period of time. At the same time that this was unfolding, the 10-year anniversary of Matt Stewart's murder came and went, and as you just heard Freddie recount, there was no kind of announcement or anything from local law enforcement. None of the governmental bodies attached to this case have commented on it in nearly a decade, and if they are still actively investigating it, it's unlikely to be a high priority for them. In fact, this story has not been reported on much at all over the past several years, with one of the lone exceptions being the Unforgotten podcast, as well as some press releases tied into that, as Freddie has tried to raise awareness for this case. In the 2+ years since he began working on Unforgotten, Freddie has attempted to raise awareness by reaching out to other journalists and investigators, unsuccessfully lobbying them to cover the case. It wasn't until just recently that Freddie and I touched base, thanks to Erica Kelly from Southern Fried True Crime, who put us in touch, and I began to learn about Matt's story. I would love to continue covering this case in the near future, and I would encourage anyone that knew Matt to reach out to me so that we can chat. I'm approaching the case as an open book, and I would like to release more information about this story in the near future. If you would rather reach out to Freddie, you can do so as well. Like I said, he continues to gather information in this case, and while he has no intentions of releasing additional episodes in his podcast, his knowledge in the case is really unparalleled, and he could be found at the Unforgotten Podcast website or directly at unforgottenpod@gmail.com. If anyone listening has specific information about the murder of Matt Stewart, I would encourage you reach out to the Mooresville Police Department at 704-664-3311. Or, if you would rather remain anonymous, you can call Crime Stoppers at 704-658-9056. The $11,000 reward for information should still stand, and can be claimed by anyone that gives information leading to an arrest. If you are listening to this podcast and you're just learning about Matt Stewart's case for the first time, then I would encourage you to reach out to the local leadership of Mooresville, the mayor, the police chief, the city council, anyone, and demand a relaunched or retooled investigation into this savage and tragic crime. Tell them you would like a dedicated cold case investigator to be brought in to handle the case, or you would like it to be handed off to some other local law enforcement agency, perhaps the State Bureau of Investigation, because the Mooresville PD have had 11 years to solve this case, and they have failed to do so. It's time to give someone else a crack at it. Until such a time, the story of Matt Stewart will remain unresolved. Thank you for listening to this episode of Unresolved. I would like to give a huge thank you to Freddie Wilson from the Unforgotten podcast for all of his help with this episode. The story of Matt Stewart would be impossible to tell without all of the research he has done over the past few years, a lot of which he displays on his website at unforgottenpodcast.com. If you are interested in learning more about this story, please check out the Unforgotten podcast, as it truly does explore everything I've detailed in this episode in much greater detail. I would like to say thank you to Freddie once again for all of his hard work, and his patience. We started chatting right before I moved cross country, and this episode ended up getting delayed quite a bit as a result. Thanks for having the patience of a saint, Freddie. I have been your host, Micheal Whelan. This episode of the show was researched, written, and produced by myself, and the music throughout this episode was put together by yours truly through Amber Music. The song you're hearing right now, though, is the Unresolved theme song, which was written and composed by Ailsa Traves. For a full list of sources and references, please head to the podcast website at unresolved.me. Before I go, I would like to thank the amazing producers of Unresolved who support this show each month through Patreon. These wonderful people are Roberta Jansen, Ben Crocum, Gabriella Bromley, Peggy Bellarda, Quill Carter, Laura Hannon, Damian Moore, Brittany Norris, Amy Hampton, Stephen Wilson, Scott Meesey, Marie Vankland, Scott Patzold, Travis Sepko, Aime McGregor, Sydney Scotton, Sarah Moscaratolo, Sue Kirk, Thomas Ahern, Brian Hall, Seth Morgan, Marion Welsh, Joe Wong, Patrick Loxo, Alyssa Lawton, Meadow Landry, Tatum Bautista, Tunya Elzinga, Michelle Watson, Ryan Green, Stephanie Joyner, Dawn Keller, and Alyssa Hampton Dutro. Thank you all so much. I know I missed the end credits last week because of a time crunch issue and some production woes, which you might have heard about if you saw my post on social media, but words cannot express how much I appreciate each and every one of you. I truly do appreciate how much you all continue to support me and this podcast. Just the other day, on October 7th, we passed the 5-year benchmark of this podcast, and I cannot believe it's been going on this long. I could not have done it without the support of each and every one of you, so thank you. Now, here's to another 5 years. I should be back with another episode next week, but until then, I hope you all stay safe and stay healthy. I will talk to you later.